Now I see a number of participants coming in. Um, so my name is Bruce Gordon, and I lead the WASH work at WHO. And I wanted to welcome everyone from Stockholm because this is part of the Stockholm World Water Week. And you may see myself and a few colleagues sequestered in their hotels to give you better sound quality, although we're running around from session to session, as you can imagine. But this is the launch of the 2024 report on SDG indicator 6.3.1, which is, of course, about safely treated wastewater. And on behalf of WHO and UN Habitat and important partners like Agence Française de Développement and the Environmental Protection Agency, or sorry, the University of Technology, UTS Sydney, we're going to be able to tell you a little bit more about the report. Now, but just before that, I think we're all aware that we have, unprecedented levels of pollution, and they're obviously limiting our freshwater resources, but they're impacting our drinking water. They're making already scarce water supplies even scarcer, and they're often impacting the most vulnerable in our societies. So we have that challenge, we have that urgency. We've been faced with a very limited data sets over the last decades. And I think what is exciting is that we're having more and more data come to the fore so we can understand some of the challenges we're facing. Um, but on a kind of a significant level, when we talk about global challenges, of course, we have extreme weather events, we have climate change, and we are challenged in terms of wastewater management by these extremes of flooding and drought. So being able to keep track of it globally, nationally, and locally is ever more important. So of course, we believe when you look at these results, will need to focus even more. There'll be more attention needed, and to support the wastewater 2030 commitment, which we know is a key part of the outcome of the UN conference in New York, and it's our commitment for 2030. Now you're going to hear a lot more from Rick, from Graham, from Marcus, from Lionel. And we want to also hear from you, comments, questions, suggestions in the comment box. I don't know about the technology and if that will work as well as we hope, but we hope it will. Um, but just to say the takeaway is, and recognizing that this is the third global report on SDG indicator 631, that we have a more robust analysis, although we really have critical data gaps, meaning that we're still not able to kind of say everything with the confidence that we would like to say, although it appears we're not moving fast enough to meet the SDG ambition of having the proportion of untreated wastewater by 2030. So I'm going to leave it up to the team to tell you more about domestic wastewater, industrial wastewater, and what we know about total wastewater and the treatment thereof. But we also wanted to mention that this report is also highlighting the importance of wastewater reuse. And that's again, particularly in the context of climate change and the linkages between inadequate wastewater treatment and adverse health outcomes. So welcome again. Thank you for joining us from around the world. And with that, I think I'd like to pass it directly over to Graham Alabaster from UN Habitat. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm Graham Alabaster. I'm the head of UN Habitat's office in Geneva, but I'm the co-custodian along with Rick at WHO and our dear colleagues in UNSD. So this is a very exciting time for us. We've all been working on wastewater for many years, and this is the third report, as Bruce said, in what's proving to be a very interesting area of work. Have the next slide, please, Rick. So just revisiting the target and goal, this is about, of course, improving water quality as an overall 6.3. And the part we're dealing with is 631, which is, if you like, the upstream side of the indicator. It's talking about the pollution. And for us, the wastewater is comprised of two basic parts, that coming from domestic sources and the rest from other sources, non-domestic sources, including industrial and other things. And the two agencies, WHO and UN Habitat, share this indicator, with UN Habitat focusing on the total and industrial wastewater and WHO focusing on the domestic wastewater. But in order for us to report on the goal as dictated by the SDG, of course, we need to have all parts of this indicator and to fully understand it. Could I have the next slide, please, Rick? So this is the third in a series of reports. The first one that we started in 2018, we had quite sparse data. And in fact, that report mainly sought to show the indicators for the methodologies for both the indicators, which is slightly different for domestic as opposed to total industrial. We got more data with the 2021 report. And although with this new report in 2024, we haven't got enough data to make a full global estimate for the whole indicator, we are certainly almost there. And hopefully by the next time we report in 3 years, we will be able to report on the complete part of the indicator. So there's a long history to this, which we've all been working on for quite some years. The direction is good in terms of getting data. But as Bruce said, we're way behind meeting the SDG target. Next slide, please. Of course, wastewater is really very much linked to many of the other SDG 6 targets, not just SDG 6, but other SDGs. And apart from, the local engagement in water and sanitation management, we have aspects, of course, protecting water-related ecosystems, the goal 6.1 on drinking water, 6.2 on sanitation and open defecation, but also on 6.4, which is about water use efficiency and ensuring sustainable wastewater supplies, and finally, of course, on integrated water resources management. So this part of indicator 6 SDG 6 is a very, very important part, and it interlinks with many of the other parts. Next slide, please, Rick. So I've mentioned already about it linking to all of the other indicators on the SDGs. There's a linkage to all of them, suffice it to say, but of course, some more than others, but many of them very, very important for the other SDGs. And the next slide, please, Rick. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, that the responsibility for monitoring different parts of these indicators is split between WHO and UN Habitat. And UN Habitat focuses on the total wastewater and industrial wastewater generated. And you can see on the slide there, the sources of wastewater, agricultural, but only point source. Of course, this part of the indicator doesn't count for non-diffuse wastewater, but also coming from industrial installations. And these can be, of course, all sorts of things. This can be airports, hotels, and all sorts of other things. Whereas, of course, WHO are focusing on the domestic wastewater. And we use different sources of data to get our estimates for this indicator, which we'll go into a little bit more detail further down in the presentation. But it's very important for everyone to realize that there are slight differences in the methodology. And we are, of course, working to harmonize those more in the future. But this is a consistent methodology that we've used since the first report. So, of course, it enables us to report, hopefully, on the trends. And the next slide, please, Rick. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the total industrial wastewater, which UN Habitat are responsible for collecting. Next slide, please. But before we go into that, the idea, of course, that wastewater is part of a circular economy, as highlighted by Bruce in the UN Water Conference last year. And I think it's really, really important. Member states are increasingly getting interested in this particular indicator because of its links to things like climate crisis and pollution. So really, there's a whole new opportunity as we move forward in the remaining 5 years until we reach the SDG for us to understand a lot of what we're doing as part of wastewater in a climate resilient world. So For those of you who are interested, we can, of course, give you more details on the wastewater commitment and what many of the member states signed up to, and how you can see that wastewater is an important part of this commitment. And the next slide, please. So basically, the sources of data for total industrial wastewater come from a variety of different sources, both questionnaires, which are launched by Eurostat, OECD, and the United Nations Statistics Division, and also some data that we as UN Habitat collect directly from the national statistic offices and the line ministries. So you can see in that slide a sort of breakdown of where we are in terms of where the data comes from. You can see almost the majority of it comes from the UNSD UNEP questionnaire, but we have significant from other sources. So this is basically the sources of data that are used to compute the estimates for total and industrial wastewater. Next slide, please, Rick. So just really showing again how this is a bit different. We can show in this slide very quickly, schematically, how the wastewater generated for total and industrial is collected. A lot of it comes from point sources of agriculture, from industry, from the manufacturing, mining and quarrying industries and construction industries. Very importantly, we don't, of course, include cooling water into this indicator because that would change the whole indicator. So cooling water is accepted, but wastewater from all sorts of other industries. So the total wastewater is reported from those sources of data, showing the collection systems, both through urban public sewage, but also some independent treatment plants. Of course, it's much easier to collect information through a network to municipal sewers, and that's where a lot of our information comes from. And it's difficult to get information, particularly from independent type of treatment plants. But of course, we're working on that. And as I mentioned earlier, the amount of data that's coming forward is increasing month by month, in fact. And the next slide, please, Rick. So here is an upset of all of the member states that reported for this report. And you can see that only 73 out of 190 odd member states are actually reporting both total industrial waste, total wastewater generation and treatment. So that only is equivalent to 50% of the world's population. In order for us to make a global estimate, we have to report on 50% of the population and 50% of the countries. So although we've met there in terms of, we've met the target in terms of percentage of population, we haven't met it on the number of member states. But as you can see, we are reasonably close. So there is just a quick schematic. Apologies for the size, but you can closely look at this in the report and you can see both for generation and treatment how the figures vary for those member states that are reported. And the next slide, please. If we look at industrial wastewater generation and treatment, you can see the picture is far worse, with only 22 states actually reporting on the proportion of industrial wastewater that they generate, which is equivalent to about 10% of the world's population, which of course is very, very low. It's very important to realize that we can't report on the whole indicator unless we have all of this information, because if you remember, the title of the indicator includes wastewater from all sources. So we still have a long way to go. But what's probably encouraging, there are some countries who you would think maybe by virtue of their levels of income that they wouldn't be able to report. But we are getting some data from those countries. And this is, of course, very encouraging, especially in some of the water-short countries where they do report very closely on industrial wastewater treatment. And the next slide, please, Rick. Just to show you how things have changed since the first report, you can see that now we are getting a lot more data, both from total and industrial and the population that we're covering. So the trend is very good, and hopefully by the time we report next, we should be able to announce a global estimate. But you can see again from this graph that the real issue lies in getting data on non-domestic sources on industrial wastewater treated. And the next slide, please. We'd mentioned a little bit in the opening comments about the important issue that water reuse is now playing in a circular economy. And we've started to collect data on this in this recent report because it really is a really, really important issue for the future. As countries become more water scarce, the opportunities for reuse of wastewater is becoming more and more apparent. There are many, of course, water-short countries that already recycle a lot of wastewater, and they have standards to do so. But in fact, this is one of the things that is driving wastewater treatment and wastewater monitoring. So, for the first time in this report, we have started to collect statistics on wastewater reuse, which is extremely important. And the next slide, please. I wanted to give you here one very good example of a country that we've been working with, who's a co-sponsor of this event, the country of Ghana in West Africa, who actually have gone and done a deep dive in Ghana, and they've looked at all sources, not only sources of wastewater generated and treated, but they've also compared that with water consumption, which is, of course, very interesting. They've monitored and they've used their data from many industrial and non-domestic sources to compute some very, very good figures. So if you like, this is a model of what countries, if everybody could do what Ghana is doing in terms of these type of estimates, we would be able to report on the indicator immediately. So here's a very good example. There are more details in the report of this, but you will find some very interesting data and a very good analysis of wastewater from all of the sources done by the Environmental Protection Agency in the government, by the government of Ghana. And the next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Rick for the domestic part. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Graham. So this is Rick Johnston at WHO, based in Geneva, and we're responsible for monitoring the domestic wastewater fraction of indicator 6.3.1. First, I just wanted to clear up what domestic wastewater is and how that relates to household wastewater, because in principle, domestic wastewater is composed of wastewater generated by households themselves, but also what we call services. So these might be commercial businesses or hotels that are discharging waste into sewers or into on-site treatment plants, but it's mostly human waste. You know, it's black water from toilets, it might be gray water from sinks and showers and things like that. So it's quite different from industrial wastewater, which can have very different characteristics than household wastewater. However, what this chart on the right shows you, this is the proportion of domestic wastewater which is comprised of services and households, with the dark color representing households. And there's only a handful of countries that actually report on both services and households. And the proportion is quite variable, you can see. And because the data coverage is quite low for services in general, for the purposes of SDG reporting for now, WHO is restricting its analysis to that of household wastewater. So even though the indicator refers to domestic wastewater, we're really reporting on household wastewater. So bear that in mind as we walk through the rest of the section. You saw from Graham a little schematic about how we process data on wastewater from generation through collection and delivery and treatment, finally to discharge. And we do the same thing for the household wastewater component. The difference here, of course, is that we're really focusing in only on households, and that we're interested in the black water generated through toilets, but also in the gray water, the other household uses of wastewater. And we consider that sewers can receive both black water and gray water. Septic tanks can also, in principle, receive gray water. They don't always. But people who have other kinds of sanitation, who have pit latrines or who don't have any type of improved sanitation at all, they're really not collecting household wastewater. So they're not considered eligible for safely treated wastewater under SDG 6.3.1. So what we do then is we look at first those who have sewer lines, and we see, well, how much of what goes into a sewer is actually delivered to treatment? What kind of treatment does it get? Is it secondary treatment or higher? Or is there data from the country about compliance with relevant national or local standards that could count as safely treated? Or the stuff that goes into septic tanks. Well, what happens to that? Does it actually go into a leach field, or does it have an overflow line that just connects directly to the environment? Some of it may end up being emptied and trucked to some kind of centralized treatment. So each of those nodes on this graph is something that would have a data point then, and we would look for national sources of data to tell the whole picture of on-site sanitation and off-site sanitation for safely treated wastewater. Here's an example of a country that has pretty good data reporting systems. This is from Iraq, where you see there are data on how much wastewater is collected in sewers, but a larger proportion is collected in septic tanks. There's quite a lot of on-site sanitation, non-sewage sanitation in Iraq. And there's a small fraction that's not collected in septic tanks. This is mainly rural populations that still have technologies like latrines, which go straight to not safely treated. Now, within what's collected in sewers, most of it, in this case, 734 million cubic meters out of 962 collected, is delivered to an urban wastewater treatment plant. The great majority of that receives secondary or higher treatment, so that counts as safely discharged after safe treatment. Some of it doesn't reach the treatment plant, that's not safely treated. If we look at the septic tank flows, though, we see that there's quite a lot that doesn't get delivered to treatment. And that could be a nominal septic tank, which is more like a holding pit. It has an overflow line that does not connect to infiltration. It could connect to an open drain or somehow to the environment. That would be counted as not safely treated. And then again, you could have on-site treatment where there is a soak pit or leach pit, or even if the wastes are treated on site through some other technology. So this is an example from Iraq. You can find all the details of this in the Iraq country file. And we have country files for all of the countries that we have estimates for available on the WHO website. You can see the link to it on the page below. So building up from country estimates, we can then produce regional and even global estimates. And from this chart, the light blue show the numbers that we published in the 2021 report, which are for the year 2020, and then the dark blue are this current one. You can see that there's a lot of variability among regions, and that the statistics between 2020 and 2022 are fairly similar. There may be a slight improvement, but it's probably within statistical variability. So we're not in a strong position to say much about trends. Having said that, when we group all the data together at the world level, in 2021, we found that 56% of household wastewater was safely treated before discharge, and that's crept up a little bit to 58% in 2022. But again, there's big confidence limits around those estimates. Another regional figure talks about or shows the distribution of household wastewater into systems of collection like sewers or septic tanks or not collected. And you can see that in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and North America, the great majority of household wastewater is going into sewers, a little bit going into wastewater treatment plants, into septic tanks. At the world level, about 57% is collected and safely treated in sewers. Just collected in sewers, 24% collected in septic tanks. But then when you get into the more low income regions, you see, first of all, that the sewer proportion drops right down. You do see more wastewater being collected in septic tanks, but you see quite a lot that's not being collected at all, which of course would be the area to work on to improve progress towards this indicator. So if we group into regions, all the country data, and we look at who is discharging safely treated wastewater, we see that about 70% of the global flows of safely treated wastewater are happening in just two regions, the Europe and North America region in light blue, and Eastern and Southeastern Asia in dark blue. And it's actually the US and China that are the largest volumetric producers of safely treated wastewater, which reflects their large populations. There's only, if you see the orange color, that's Central and Southern Asia, they're only producing about 6% of globally safely treated wastewater. If we turn to not safely treated wastewater, we see a very different picture, where actually Central and Southern Asia are the largest contributor. India is the single largest contributor. China in Eastern and Southeastern Asia is the second largest contributor. So China could be both one of the largest dischargers of treated wastewater and not safely treated wastewater. The last thing I wanted to mention from the report is that we had a special focus. Graham mentioned the importance of climate change and reuse. We also wanted to highlight the links between inadequately treated wastewater and health. And really, there are multiple areas of concern here. We could think about cholera control. Untreated wastewater can be a driver of antimicrobial resistance. There are clear links on food safety and security. A lot of untreated or inadequately treated wastewater is used directly in agriculture, which has health challenges, but also, it's a scarce resource. So there's a balance there. There's a link with vector-borne disease. Oh gosh, recreational water quality. We've all been seeing in the news stories of untreated discharge in many high-income countries around the world. We watched with great interest how Paris really invested heavily in improving its wastewater infrastructure to cope with the untreated sewage discharges flowing into the Seine, so it could be safe for swimming in the recent Olympics. And last, I'd like to mention that with increases in armed conflict around the world, we just have to remember that protection of water and water infrastructure, including wastewater, during and after armed conflicts is critical to protect health in those challenging situations. So with that, I encourage you all to download the report. It's available or will very shortly be available on the UN Water website. You can see the link there. I've also posted a link to a related document that describes for domestic wastewater treatment the methodology that we use. We go into quite a lot of detail. So if you're interested about how those domestic wastewater numbers are calculated, please download the second link. And then that third one is those country files that I showed one example of from Iraq. Next, we're going to move to a panel discussion, and I would just like to remind people to who are watching online to paste your questions, your comments into the chat, because as soon as we hear from these three distinguished guests, we'll be turning to you, the audience, to hear your comments and questions and have an open discussion. But first, I'd like to turn to Marcus Newbury with the United Nations Statistics Division based in New York. Of course, UNSD is a co-custodian of this indicator, and you saw from one of Graham's slides that it was the single largest source of data for the total and industrial wastewater parts of the report. But still, we also saw that many countries, many UN member states are not reporting, and that there's outstanding challenges or sticking points around data coverage. So I'd like to ask Marcus, for his thoughts about what barriers there are that prevent countries from reporting more comprehensively, more accurately to these questionnaires that UNSD as well as OECD and Eurostat are circulating, and maybe to get some ideas for solutions to help national partners in collecting data. So Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rick. Hello to dear colleagues around the globe. So yeah, I'm Marcus. You'll be speaking from the statistics angle and working closely with UN Habitat and World Health Organization, on this SDG indicator. And grown a real passion and interest in the issue over the years that we've worked on it as well. And we just feel, I think my colleagues in this section would just feel such a privilege to be contributing to the 6.3.1 report and have the data that we collect from countries contribute to the report. To answer Rick's question on myself and the colleagues, we're the people who validate the questionnaires, the raw data or the data that countries have worked hard on to compile, either typically with the input of the National Statistical Office or similar agency in the country, in collaboration with oftentimes municipal wastewater treatment authorities or a Ministry of Environment who may be aggregating up data from a vast number of municipalities. We saw data shown for China and India. Just think how many municipalities data sets are being aggregated for China or India or a country of that size, another large country, to aggregate the data so that we can have an informed view of what the total volume of wastewater generated or treated is. From what we see when we validate questions, we're always trying to advocate for more interinstitutional coordination. So that's often between the federal level, National Statistical Office, and probably the Ministry of Environment or a Ministry of Water or similar type institution, as well as maybe with a provincial or state level, and quite oftentimes definitely with a municipal level authority. So whether it be through formal memoranda of understandings, We also collaborate with small island states who say informal is better than formal, that saves more time and is more expedient. These are the type of issues we sort of observe when countries report data to us. Often the stakeholder who's the focal point for the country reporting for this SDG indicator to us is informing us that, you know, another stakeholder hasn't collaborated with them. And there's a bit of this happens. So whenever we were able to empower countries to formalize agreements across institutions, we see that as a win-win, or have a working committee or something like that to help be able to provide data sets for 6.3.1. Yeah, that's my sort of concise answer to that one. Beyond what we're hoping for the countries to do themselves, of course, international agencies as well as the UN Statistics Division undertakes capacity development efforts periodically. And like, you know, as Graham showed with the example of Ghana, you know, you can do a case study with one particular country. Thank you, Rick.
Yep. Let me just follow up on something you mentioned, the challenges of aggregating data from so many generators. The NSOs have a heavy burden here, and of course, this is just one of how many indicators they're responsible for. UNSD has been collecting data, though, on wastewater for a long time. I don't know, maybe 20 years or more, I'm not sure. And I wondered if you have seen any changes in the way that NSOs are able to engage with those important national and subnational stakeholders, as drawing on your experience over time.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I'll give a bit of a precursor and say I work in an environment statistics section. So some of the comments I'm about to make would be about as applicable to water as they might be to waste and other themes within environment. Yeah, over a period of years, we've always advocated for any environment statistics that collaboration among institutions is sort of required. I think we've seen a bit of improvement in that over time, and countries being convinced that it's not just for the purposes of international reporting. That's often not enough to persuade countries to formalize a working committee or a similar type of body to collaborate with one another. Once we're able to persuade countries that it's in their best interest to be monitoring wastewater treatment, volumes of reused water that are measured and so on, once a country can be persuaded of the value of that for its domestic needs, for its own purposes, I think over time we've seen a bit of an improvement. And I generally agree with this sort of humble tone that there maybe has been a bit of a positive trend over the period, even since 2015 of this SDG time. But that would be my comment, and it applies equally to water and other themes across environment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point that national institutions, you know, can't report SDG indicators that are only for, you know, WHO and Habitat and to go into an SDG database. They have to be relevant and important at the national level. And actually, I want to ask you one more follow-up question because we saw from Graham's report that the data challenges are particularly severe around industrial wastewater. And I wonder, like, I'm linking that with this last point of making it nationally relevant. Are there any ideas that you have, or how reporting on industrial wastewater in particular could be incentivized to increase data coverage on this one? I know it's a hard one.
I think from the statistics angle, we've long before, you know, for decades and decades, there's been this sort of classification of industries that's internationally used, and then Europe has its specific relevant one, which they call NACE, but I'm referring to the International Standard Industrial Classification, which has always been used. So speaking from the statistics world, we like to label and put tags on everything that we do, and we're really interested in the indicator level, contributing to the target and then the goal. But as was shown in some of the graphs presented by Rick and Graham, some of the references to industries are precisely as they're labeled in the International Standard Classification for Industries. So we try to abide by that, and we always have. And I really think it's in the best interest for measuring wastewater and any other themes in environment that wherever we can, we do apply such an international standard. It helps our effort and work be more agreeable with those who have an economic interest, because economic statistics are also compiled using this same international standard. So we're always, when we see even raw data sets from countries, trying to persuade them that they may not be so far away from being able to apply these international standards as they think. if they've got the raw
Mm-hmm.
data sets, it might not be so difficult to assign that some of this data is surely coming from the mining industry or surely
Yes.
coming from construction and so
Yes.
on. And obviously, if we've got an industrial analysis of who's contributing, it can be so more informative. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Okay, that's a great point. Thank you, Marcus. I see we do have an active chat going on, so keep those questions and comments coming into the chat. And Marcus, we may come back to you in the open discussion section. But now I'd like to turn to Juliet, Professor Juliet Willits at University of Technology, Sydney. And to start by congratulating you, Juliet, on receiving the 2024 IWA Gender Diversity and Water Award very recently at IWA's Global Congress. So congrats. Would love to talk to you about water and gender, but today we're on wastewater. So I wanted to start by asking you about this report in particular that I know you've had a good read through, and ask you what you see to be the key policy implications given, I mean, we don't have strong trends, but we don't see any evidence of rapid improvement. So does something need to change? Are there some policy recommendations that you think that this report could support? Over to you, Juliet.
Thanks, Rick. And yes, I think I had secretly hoped that the report would show more improvement than what it does. And I think particularly it seems like the improvements were mostly in higher income countries, whereas it looked like even there were some negative trends in Asia and Africa, which is, yeah, disappointing to see. And in terms of policy implication, I think it means we need more ambitious policies that are backed by finance for the sanitation sector, and particularly public finance. There's a lot of emphasis around blended finance, private sector finance, but fundamentally sanitation and wastewater are a public service and for a public good. And Rick, you showed the different health implications. And so I think until we can advocate to get the political will to have these more ambitious policies and finance, we can tweak around the edges, but we won't be able to make the bigger changes that are definitely needed. I think to be able to reach SDG 6.3.1, it looks like we need quite radical change. And I think, yeah, in terms of the different technologies, the report, as you showed, divides out the industrial, the sewer, the on-site systems. And clearly more can be done to improve collection to centralized systems. But I think there's recognition that following the path of just large-scale centralized systems, which is how various high-income countries have reached the high levels of coverage, is extremely expensive, both in the short term when you make those investments, but also over time because you need to maintain those large assets. And as you described in the report, both of you, the increasing focus with climate change on wastewater reuse means that policies need to think about what scale is appropriate to treat wastewater in what context, and in what context would we use, at a sub area within a city. So for instance, in San Francisco, we've got recycling it within the building scale, the same in Sydney. In Singapore, we're looking at potable reuse that's more at a city scale. So depending on how we're thinking about those circles, they might be smaller or bigger, different scales, and that will, I guess, affect which technologies are adopted and the direction that policies take in different countries. Mm-hmm. And then the last comment I wanted to make is specifically around on-site systems. So as we saw in lower and middle income countries, they're very prevalent, and we really, even with the measurement that we've got, we don't know how safe a lot of them are, and particularly in areas that flood, if we're thinking about climate change impacts. And so thinking about, again, where are these systems appropriate to implement, and where should we really not be using them, and where should we be shifting to at least simplified sewerage or decentralized systems. And in my view, we're still, I guess, assuming they'll provide the solution in places where they're really not appropriate. So in some very dense informal settlements where, as you described, a lot of the effluent either goes into drains where people are exposed because they're often open drains, or it can also be infiltrating to shallow groundwater, which in many places, unfortunately, is still a water source for many communities, either for drinking or domestic use. So to me, the direction around where and how we employ on-site systems, I think, is an important policy area that needs to be looked at further, in line with, I guess, having better information about the level of safe access through that type of technology.
Right, right. I think there's a misconception that you can only have safely treated wastewater through sewer systems and conventional centralized treatment. And well, we're seeing from the existing data that that's not the case, that certainly in rural and even in some urban areas, a lot more wastewater is being safely treated through these non-sewered systems. Of course, non-sewer systems can also be terrible and just discharge untreated waste directly into the environment. You mentioned briefly how climate change might be changing things, and I wondered if I could ask you to follow up a little bit on the climate change implications, especially for on-site situations, which for on-site containments and treatment systems, which I don't know, maybe are those more vulnerable to some of the new climate risks? How do those intersect?
Sure. So yes, I guess, the report, the main emphasis regarding climate change is around a focus on circularity and the value of wastewater, for the water that's there, and also obviously for the nutrients. But yes, I think circularity is one aspect of thinking about climate change and its impact and how we deal with that on wastewater. But yeah, in research we've done in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, for on-site systems, it's really causing a lot of problems. So we've seen in places that use water-based systems, once there's insufficient water available, and then you can't flush the toilet, and therefore people are returning to open defecation, which is moving us backwards in terms of goal 6.2. And is also spreading diffuse pollution. And equally, when you have flooding, a lot of on-site systems are not fully sealed. And so either we have backflow into the systems, or they were never fully lined and sealed in the first place. And so again, we're spreading fecal matter into drains, into waterways, into canals, and where there can be human exposure. So I guess the idea of what climate resilient sanitation looks like needs to take into account those new extremes and needs to factor that into the technology and choices. And it may mean that there are, I guess, places where we really shouldn't be using those systems, and where we need to keep wastewater systems much more sealed away. And I saw there was a comment in the chat about combined sewer overflows, which has been a huge topic of discussion over recent periods. And I think the more we're able, in the places which flood, the more we're able to keep these different streams separate and deal with them separately, and have fit for purpose reuse, that will be both better protection for health and the broader environment.
Yeah, and in fact, reuse might end up being one of those drivers, coupling with climate change. Well, it's kind of heavy though. I mean, it can seem hopeless. Yeah. So, I mean, we know that the world's off track already for SDG 6.2, not even on track for basic sanitation for all. And then we have these challenges of population growth, urbanization, changing climate is just going to make it all harder. I'm going to turn next to Lionel for, I hope, some good news, because I know that Lionel Goujon at the Agence Française de Développement is working around the world with many governments and development partners, and has some examples of where we actually can, make progress in this battle for water quality and wastewater treatment. So Lionel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. Yeah, well, I don't know if I can bring such good news, but I think there are reasons to hope. And I think this report is the first good reason, actually, because for for years and even decades, we've all been repeating that about like 80% of the wastewater discharge was untreated. And now, thanks to the work you've been doing, we now have very different figures. And we know that actually more than 50% of both domestic and industrial water do receive a secondary treatment. So, I mean, you can't fight an enemy you don't know. So I see this report as a very useful baseline to define proper treatment strategies for government, development partners, and investors, and so on. Nevertheless, I would mention that my first message probably would be that we do need to keep working on data improvement for this SDG indicator 631. Because we can see in this report that data coverage, although increasing both in quality and quantity, remains too low, with a limited number of countries reporting data, particularly as regards industrial flows and on-site domestic treatment. So these gaps still make it difficult to say with confidence how quickly we are progressing or not. So my recommendation would definitely be to keep working on the coverage and quality of the data, to make sure that at least before 2030, we reach a clear understanding of where we stand as regards this issue. But of course, measuring is not an objective per se. It has to be a lever for action. And with the former assumption of 80% untreated, with no apparent progress, I must say it was quite a discouraging fight. And now with a more positive baseline and a trend, I think there is room for hope and ambition. And so my message would clearly be that I believe we can win this fight, because I can see that the topic of sanitation and wastewater treatment has taken really a larger part in the policies in the last decade. So for sure, we won't reach the SDG, by 2030, but I think we can achieve fast progress. So we've already had some success stories in some countries. I could mention Morocco or India, where dramatic progress has been achieved. Europe as well. And maybe being French, and as the topic of combined sewers was mentioned in the chat, maybe I could mention the example of Paris and the River Seine. In year 2000, so it's yesterday actually, the annual discharge of untreated water in the River Seine was about 15 million cubic meters per year. And that was due mostly to the fact that the Paris area is covered mostly by combined sewage system that cannot cope with the incoming water volume during strong rains. So an ambitious investment program has been implemented, and after 10 years of efforts, the untreated discharge was already divided by 10. And today, more than 30 species of fish return to the River Seine. And the two most recent ones, I think you know them, they are Olympians and the Mayor of Paris herself, as you probably know. So the question is how to achieve such progress in developing countries, where, of course, the financial challenge is bigger. Not only the challenge for the initial investment, actually, but also to ensure the sustainability of the service. I think we can improve the way actually we work in this domain. I could share a few ideas. As of today, I see that feasibility studies usually focus mostly on the treatment plant, and we do not have a global, clear vision of the pollution flow, taking into consideration what is lost in the collection infrastructure, for instance, or from the various sources. So a work like maybe the one that Graham showed done in Ghana, I think it could be financed within investment project more generally, so as to give each country a proper overview of the situation. And as for industrial pollution, I think the idea is to find the difficulty is to find the right incentives and the right balance between the carrot and the stick. In Dakar, for instance, at the moment, AFD is supporting technically and financially the pretreatment infrastructure of the industry in the Bay de Han, and also financing awareness actions. And we were doing that with a grant because it was considered that it was the only viable option in Dakar. But of course, this is not scalable globally. And in Morocco, for instance, we tried a different way. We provided a credit line to a national bank so as to finance pretreatment, but we saw that there was actually the demand remained very low, albeit the interesting rates that were offered through that credit line. So it's not that easy. And at the moment, a new approach we are trying, I would say, in Bangladesh, in building up on the Moroccan experience, is trying to work with the textile industry so as to modify and change the process themselves to use different chemicals, building up on the work of a foundation which is called the zero discharge of hazardous contaminant, which is trying to work with the textile industry in revising the processes so as to pollute less, because we've seen in Morocco that actually to create the demand, we had to get it from the purchaser. So actually, one of the few industry that did finance its pretreatment did that because Zara, its client from the north, was requiring it. So this is what we are trying to do now, using the world markets to incentive for investment. And also, I think we can maybe one third idea. We could, I think, improve the monitoring for the chemical and biological quality of the aquatic environments, so as to measure the impact of the remediation projects. And that actually makes the links with the target 632 on water bodies quality. And to give an example, in the city of Hashuri in Georgia, we are financing a treatment plant for about 30,000 people. That includes also over 1,000 septic tanks. But we also fund the river quality monitoring system. Nevertheless, I must admit that this is still not systematic in our operations. And maybe one last point, I think it has been mentioned, we do need to promote citywide inclusive approaches that are complementing centralized sanitation infrastructure project by financing on-site treatment infrastructure or sewage sludge treatment infrastructure. And you show in your report that no more than 12% of decentralized systems do have safely managed wastewater. So there's obviously progress to be reached in that area. And I think mention too should be made to a multi donor working group led by the Gates Foundation, in which we participate, and it's preparing a joint statement that should be published in the next Cairo Water Week in the fall of 2024, and where donor will commit to improve their practice in the matter of seawise approaches.
Great,
well,
and that
this is
links
it.
back
Just
to
to make a quick link with climate change, I would just like to mention, you said climate change is a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity for wastewater treatment, because we can show better the impact in terms of mitigation and resilience that we can bring. And so maybe that could be a topic of focus, an additional one for the next report. Maybe if you could measure, for instance, the biogas production, that would help make the link with the climate community for wastewater. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. And yeah, there are so many good ideas in there. And we did well to turn to you for some examples that it is possible to make real change, even in resource constrained environments. So lots of great stuff in there. I wanted to respond to a bunch of them, but we're running a little on time. So I want to take the few remaining minutes that we have now to turn to Andrew Shantz, who's one of the lead author from the WHO side of the report, but who's also been keeping an eye on the chat. So Andrew, maybe you could pull out some key questions or comments, and we can throw them to the panelists or possibly to the authors of the report. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. Really appreciate all the comments and notes that have come up in the chat. You can still add them and we'll still take note of them, but just to highlight a few, Maybe the first one from Samuel Fataya. He noted that there's a lot of gaps. I'm just paraphrasing, but there's a lot of gaps in progress responsible in lower income regions and countries, many of which have been exploited through colonial histories. And so what can be done from a policy perspective to ensure that higher income countries contribute their fair share to sanitation and wastewater improvements going forward? So maybe I'll open that one up to the panel if anyone wants to tackle that one.
It's not an easy question. I think Marcus, this is less your wheelhouse, but I don't know if Juliet, if you had any insights from your work, especially in the Pacific area, or Lionel, as you know, as a high income country, if there are any, if that rings any, if that resonates in any way with either of you, actually.
Yeah, I would maybe just first add that, yeah, I guess through development assistance programs, sanitation is one priority amongst many, many, many others. And at least in our case, I'm from Australia, and our dealings with our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We made a lot of progress in the last 5 to 10 years to increase the understanding of how big an issue the lack of wastewater treatment is, and the lack of sanitation, to bring it to be a stronger policy priority. It now has again slipped, and I think we need to do more, and having reports like this is really valuable, I guess, for making the case why more funding is needed in this area. But they're all, it also needs to be that country governments are giving it priority. It can't just be about transfer of funds from developed to developing nations. I think it also needs the internal advocacy within those countries to bring it to be a higher priority, and to have corresponding support, because the amount that comes from development assistance is a drop in the ocean compared to what's needed overall. But maybe Lionel, you've got further ideas.
No, of course, I fully agree that international assistance is only can only be a catalyst in the global financing needs. And we have to see that some political commitments were made but not fulfilled. And we can remind the Equini Declaration, which was, I think, back in 2008 or 5, and governments committed to use a share 0.5 of their GDP to sanitation, and did not manage to. So although convinced of the need of a higher political priority, I mean, there are also other ways of financing sanitation that should looked after. And if we take the example of developed countries, just to give an example, many of them finance sanitation through land value capture. And that's a scheme that is very little used, to my knowledge, in developing countries. So that might be an area as well to dig into. But it takes strong policies for that, so it's not that easy.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Juliet and Lionel. There were a few methodological questions as well in the comments. There's certainly more information that can be found in the indicator report, which has been linked by Rick, which will be available very soon online, as well as the methodological note for domestic wastewater. That represents a very comprehensive detailing of all the methodological details. So there were questions about combined sewer overflows, as well as the role of independent wastewater treatment as opposed to offsite, more formalized wastewater treatment facilities. So I would refer you to those documents if you have specific methodological questions. And you're also, of course, very welcome to contact us by email, for example. We can certainly provide additional details and answer questions. But I think that's about all the time we have. And I just wanted to close the Q&A and turn things back over to Graham for closing remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And thank you indeed, all of the speakers and presenters from today. I think it's been a very rich session. We've crammed a lot into 1 hour. But I think that there is now, as Lionel said, there's a huge opportunity here, and we need to be optimistic. And we very much hope that by 2030 we can at least have some of the solutions there. We have good examples already from countries where this is happening. I think really, it's really very important. Just coming into homing on a couple of issues, we shouldn't forget the linkage of 631 and 632. This was again highlighted by Lionel, but this cause and effect of pollution and impact on water resources is incredibly important. And, you know, we're actually working with our sister agency in UNEP to try and look about ways, but this, of course, is another complex thing to do. And of course, especially as such of the ambient water quality relates to diffuse sources of pollution from runoff. So it's not very easy. It's nothing that you can model, but we're working in that direction. One issue that I think, I mean, you know, we've heard about the climate as a driver. I'd like to mention a little bit about the urbanization. By 2050, 68% of the world's population will live in an urban agglomeration. And in many of the countries in the south, those urban areas, at least half of them will be informal settlements where data at the moment is not captured. So as Juliet said, we really have to understand how this urbanization, we've done some calculations, and 70% of the land area that will exist in 2050 has yet to be built on. So we have a huge opportunity to influence the way we manage wastewater, sanitation and water, and to understand in a context, a specific context, what the right combination is of on-site, off-site, decentralized and centralized, because there's no one size fits all. There's no blanket approach anywhere in the globe. We have to look at what's happening. As we look to the future, wastewater is going to be very interesting. We started talking about reuse in the indicator report now, but there's lots of interesting work being done on plastic pollution, microplastics in wastewater. And of course, the other thing that probably doesn't come up very often is the fact that we can also monitor people's health very closely. There's been a lot of work going on monitoring drug residues, for example, in wastewater from cities. And this is another area of work that we did some work, of course, with the COVID crisis. But the wastewater, looking at wastewater as a future predictor for other issues will be, I think, an increasingly important area of our work. But we've run out of time, I'm afraid. Please, for any of you who would like to reach out to us, either Rick or myself or Marcus or indeed any of the speakers, we're more than happy to support you and offer support, particularly from your countries, if you would like some technical assistance in regard to how to improve your monitoring. So I wish all of you a good rest of the day. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to receiving comments on your report. Thank you to everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.